Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. We are back. It is March 7th, March 8th, March 8th, and we are moving right along this semester. Today we are talking about fats. So this is the last of the macronutrients that we have to discuss. We've talked about carbs, we've talked about protein. Finally, we're going to talk about fats. I think today is a very useful application of understanding fats. I tried to use two examples of how, one, how you can break down fat macronutrients, and two, application of certain exercise intensities that are appropriate to maximize fat utilization. So I think it should end up being pretty cool and useful for you guys in understanding how to do those two things. So let's jump right in. All right, so overview. I think I cover 6.1 through 6.5 in this presentation. I've purposely neglected 6.6 and 6.7 of the chapter. You guys should read that on your own. Again, I'm trying to keep this as simple and concise as possible for those of you that are watching this at home, which is all of you. Take-home points, right? The major take-home points. You just get nothing other than this, right? And you should already know this. A lot of this is a review. Fat is the predominant energy source at rest and low to moderate exercise intensities, right? So our relative contribution to energy is much higher at low exercise intensities than it is at higher exercise intensities where carbohydrate takes over. Second major point is that fat metabolism takes time and require significant amounts of oxygen, right? It takes time. So let's get right into it. Fatty acids, sterols, and phospholipids. So let's talk about fatty acids or fats. We've already talked about the structure of carbs, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. We've talked about the structure of proteins. What was that differentiating element in protein? Right? You guys should all know off the top of your head, nitrogen being the major different element. Fats aren't very different than carbs, right? Just their structure is different and their chemical composition is different. The elements are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Let's skip to this. So let's talk about saturated versus unsaturated. So saturated simply means that there's no double bonds between your carbons. So if you look at your book, early on in the chapter, there's a nice picture which shows the chemical structure of a fat. And it's carbons straight across as the main chain bound to hydrogens, right? At the end of the chain is a carboxyl group, right? But throughout the chain, there are no double bonds between the carbon, and that would create a saturated fat, right? It is fully saturated, no double bonds. Next would be unsaturated, and that simply means that there is one or more double bonds throughout that straight chain of carbons, right? Breaking down a little bit further, if there's one double bond, it should be monounsaturated. If there's two or more, it would be polyunsaturated fat. For polyunsaturated fats, we could break this down a little bit further, right? This is where it'll start to be a little bit more relevant. What's that fat that we are told we should never have, right? That's your trans fat, right? So trans fat, right, is where your hydrogens are on opposing ends of the double bonds between carbon. Excuse me. Cis, right, is where the hydrogen is on the same ends of the double bonds. The cis is a naturally formed compound. Trans fats are synthetic. They are not naturally found. We create them, right? Now, why do we create them? So early on, in like the 1920s, 1930s, I could be wrong on the decade, but in the 1900s, we realized that we needed to preserve food for longer. One way we went about doing this was creating hydrogenated oil and cooking with hydrogenated oil. the cost of cooking with hydrogenated oil was also much cheaper, right? So we created this hydrogenated oil, and it also improved the taste of the product. In the ensuing decades, we started to realize that this hydrogenated oils were started to be associated with cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. And I don't think it's villainized as much now because we have we understand how bad trans fats are, but trans fats, are very closely linked to cardiovascular disease, and I think most people are aware of that these days. So where are trans fats? If you read the label, it's anything that says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated. So generally, I wouldn't say generally speaking, you want to avoid anything that says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated. So the best example is pretty much like the oil in like French fries at McDonald's, right? Any fried food, right? Those are things you probably would want to avoid. Omegas. So you've got your omegas. Omega fatty acid, you'll see a double bond at the end of the carbon chain. So it's a double bond between carbons at the end of the carbon chain. This is at the opposite end of the carboxyl group. Again, you could find this early on in your text for chapter 6. We've got omega-3s and 6s, which is probably what you guys know about the most, and omega-9s. Omega-3s are probably the most discussed. And I'll tell you guys right now, I spent a solid 2 minutes trying to practice pronouncing these words, and I'm not going to try it. I'm not going to try it over video. Listen, I talk specifically about EPA and DHA with clients often, but I never pronounce them. These are your omega-3s, and we have a decent amount of research supporting that omega-3s can help improve or decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease and reduce systemic inflation. Generally speaking, we want to eat in a ratio of about 4-to-1, where it's 4 omega-6s for every 1 omega-3. And the ratio the average American diet is about 15-to-1, right? So by improving that ratio, you simply have to just eat more omega-3s. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people will supplement with omega-3s. And I could just tell you from personal experience, what I do, I don't really take much in terms of supplements. I take protein powder, I take creatine, and the only other thing I take religiously is an omega-3 supplement. That's it. That's what I've been doing for many years at this point. There's a lot of research supporting omega-3s. I usually shoot for about 2 to 3 grams. So I would recommend that you do your diligence in learning how omega-3s can be beneficial to the average person. And if you find the research seems to agree with what I'm saying, maybe you should take omega-3s. Maybe you should recommend omega-3s after you've researched it enough. Got a nice cool picture here. So of our fats, when we're talking about digestion, absorption, and metabolism, 95% of our fats come in the form of fatty acids. The other 5% are sterols and phospholipids. And they are, right, although they're only 5% of our diet, they are incredibly important, right? So what are our sterols or phospholipids? We're talking about cholesterol, cortisol, right, vitamin D, right? And all of these have very important functions, the most being providing structural support within the cell membrane. Okay, so very important that we maintain some inclusion of sterols and phospholipids within our dietary protocols. All right, so digestion, absorption, and transportation. So as far as digestion goes, similar to what we've talked about thus far, in that everything starts to be digested in the mouth, however, in the stomach, but the vast majority takes place within the small intestine. Something to note with regards to fats is fats typically slow gastric emptying and increase satiety. What does this mean in practical application when you're working with athletes? If you're working with athletes in that, that we'll talk about maybe the pre-workout window, that 0 to 60 minutes, also in the peri-workout window, so while you're working out, and probably in the post-workout window, right? We don't want to include fats in our diet, okay? Right? Why is that? Well, we want to absorb our carbohydrates, our glucose, our glycogen right away for energy. So in that pre-workout and that peri-workout window, especially if you're an endurance athlete, you want those simple sugars with no fats in them because it's going to slow the digestion, and we want to avoid this. Similarly, in that post-workout window, we want to increase the absorption of protein, right? So because of that, right, in that post-workout window, we also want to keep our fat intake very low, right? So our fat intake really should be in that, 3 to 4 hours post-workout, all the way to about 1 to 2 hours pre-workout, right? So 2 hours pre-workout, 2 hours pre-workout to the workout, through the workout, 2 hours post-workout. That's about 5-6 hours. We shouldn't really be taking in any fats. All right, so the other 18 hours of the day, that's when you can get your fats. Okay, so we've got to break down our fats for our small intestine to actually absorb our fats, right? And they absorb into the mucosal cells of the small intestine, right? Once they're absorbed, right, because they're broken down, they need to be resynthesized into triglycerides. Typically, right, there's 3 different types of triglycerides. There's a small chain, medium chain, and a long chain triglyceride. Typically, we resynthesize, right, our fatty acids into long chain triglycerides. Long chain triglycerides cannot be transported within the blood. They have to be bound and formed what we call a chylomicron, right? So this is essentially a transporter protein, a lipoprotein, all right? And it transports our triglycerides, our cholesterol, and our phospholipids. Small chain fatty acids and medium chain fatty acids can be transported directly in the blood. All right, so that's a key distinction. The chylomicrons have to be transported differently, and they have to be transported through the lymphatic vessels. Very distinct, right? And this is another reason why you'll see, I thought it was at the end of that slide, it is a slow process. As far as storage goes, once the lipoproteins, the chylomicrons, transport the fatty acids throughout the body, they have to be broken down, and that's where lipoprotein lipase comes in. It starts to break down the chylomicrons, and from there, they can be sent to our muscle, usually our slow twitch, our adipose tissue, right? That's our fat around our body, or our heart. So as far as exercise goes, right? Let's just say we've ate a meal, and then we begin exercise. We have to mobilize our fat. We have to get it go. If it's in our adipose tissue, because it could also be stored within our within our muscle, right? We have to mobilize it. That's step 1. Then we need to transport it. Step 2. It needs to be taken up by the muscle or taken up by the mitochondria, however you want to look at it. It needs to be prepared for oxidation. And inevitably, this is a very slow process, much slower than glucose or glycogen metabolism. So, as far as metabolism goes, you have to know that 1 gram of fat equates to approximately 9 calories of energy. So this is essentially much more energy dense than a carbohydrate or protein. You guys should know those equate to 1 gram of carb and protein equates to approximately, and you guys think it here, 4 calories of energy. So as we need to, or as again, we start to to exercise, how do we mobilize our fatty acids, right? To remove it from storage from our adipose tissue, we need to upregulate hormone-sensitive lipase, right? And what this does is hormone-sensitive lipase chops off the glycerol molecule of a fatty acid. So then you're left with 3 fatty acids that are free, and then 1 free glycerol molecule. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are your adrenaline hormones, growth hormone, and cortisol, all upregulate hormone-sensitive lipase. So, essentially, as you kind of get into that fight or flight mode, you can also burn more fat for energy. What we should know is that insulin inhibits hormone-sensitive lipase production. So essentially what that means is as we eat a meal, especially a high-carb meal, right, our insulin spikes. So in that post-meal window, right, the first 1, 2, 3 hours post-meal, right, we're not really going to mobilize or be able to break down fat for energy, okay? So let's say we have now broken down, right, the triglyceride, right? So we break down the triglyceride by chopping off the glycerol. We've left with 3 fatty acids. And what do? We need to move it. Glycerol, right, is largely metabolized in the liver. However, the fatty acids cannot freely travel in the blood. The fatty acids, those 3 fatty acids, have to be bound to a transporter protein. This transporter protein is called albumin, right? Once albumin, all right, or once fatty acids are bound to albumin, then they can be transported to the muscle cells. It enters the muscle cell. Once it enters the muscles, we have to convert the fatty acids to acetyl coenzyme A, right? And we do this at the mitochondria membrane. Once the fatty acid, or the acetyl at this point, is at the mitochondria membrane, it has to translocate to within the mitochondria. Remember, the mitochondria is where beta oxidation takes place, right? But in order to translocate the mitochondria membrane, we need another transport protein. Usually, these are various types of carnitine carriers. We have carnitine enzymes that help increase the speed of this reaction. And there's several of them. That's why I didn't, I wrote carriers. And then finally, once these fatty acids, which are now acetyl-CoA, enter the mitochondria, right, then it can finally undergo beta oxidation to produce energy. So what you should see, again, that this is a very slow process. There's many steps, and because it requires because it's beta oxidation, it requires large amounts of O2. All right, so on to the practical stuff. So you guys should remember, right? How do we measure energy expenditure? Right? How do we measure energy expenditure? Think for a second. What do we do? Energy expenditure, if you remember, I think it's chapter 2, maybe chapter 3, is measured through indirect calorimetry. Right? Or simply put, we use a metabolic cart. The metabolic cart measures the gas exchange. And this measurement can give you what's called a respiratory exchange ratio. Right? The respiratory exchange ratio is going to determine what we use for energy, or at least it's going to tell you what we're using for energy. So an RER of 0.70 or something close to it means we're using predominantly fat. As exercise intensity increases, right, your RER will increase. And finally, as we get closer to 1.0, we are using predominantly carbohydrates for energy. All right, so exactly what I just said. As exercise intensity increases, we increase our relative contribution of carbohydrates while decreasing our relative contribution of fat. Now, Next slide is the important one. So the graphics at the top, okay? Sorry for the line, I thought I deleted that. But the graphics at the top, right? You guys have seen this already, where I talked about as exercise intensity increases, carbohydrate utilization increases. So if you look at, let's just look at the graphic on the left here, right? When exercise intensity is very low, right? Let's say our exercise intensity is 30% VO2 max, right? Our contribution of carbohydrate is very low. So we are burning, right? I'll say we're burning mostly fat for energy. We're burning, let's say 90% of our energy comes from fat, right? Then as we start to exercise more, maybe only 50% of our energy, right? At 50% VO2 max, these are arbitrary numbers, at 50% of our VO2 max, it might be 50% from fat, but at high exercise intensities, we might be using 90% carbs, 10% fat. So what the book did was it gave you a really cool case study where if you look at this graphic in the top, you might think, well, I want to burn mostly fat, so I'm going to keep my exercise intensity low. And even based on this graphic, it would say I should keep my exercise intensity super low, right? Why don't I just sit down, right? Like right now as we're sitting, we're probably using 90% carbs for energy, which means let's just sit here all day and I should burn fat, right? And this is where absolute numbers, absolute values come into play. So this chart on the bottom is an example of a case study of a marathon runner, and they hooked him up to a metabolic cart. At rest, right? So that's that first row. At rest, right? He was contributing 78% fat for energy and 22% carbs. As soon as he started to exercise at a very low intensity, right? His heart rate was relatively low, it was only 127. Right? As soon as he started exercising, it started to switch already. And he was using almost, it says 59% carbs. This is the second row. And 41% fat. Okay? So all of a sudden, right away, people start to be like, well, I'm using 60% carbs already. Why don't I just sit at rest where I'm using a larger percentage of fat, right? However, he's burning a lot more calories, okay? So look at the total energy expended per minute. That is the third column. It says energy expenditure. So at rest, he's burning like 1.4 calories per minute, right? Of those 1.4 calories, 78% are fat, which means his total fat burn per minute, 78% of 1.4 is 1.1 grams per minute, right? But now, if you go down to the second row here, when he just starts exercising, and in his second row, he's now burning 59% carbs, 41% fat. However, his total energy expenditure has went through the roof. It's increased almost tenfold almost. Because of that, right, the absolute value of his fat burning and his carbohydrate burning is way higher. So now we're taking 41% of this 11.5 number comes from fat. And all of a sudden, this person is now burning 4.7 grams per minute of fat, that's like a fourfold increase over our resting conditions. So even though we're burning relative, right, the relative contribution, the percentage is more carbs, the absolute value is still way higher than it was at rest, right? 1.1 grams per minute versus, or calories per minute, calories per minute. 1.1 calories per minute versus 4.7 calories per minute. And if you take it a step further, you can even look at the next exercise intensity where he's running at 9 minutes per mile in that third row. Once again, he's burning 63% carbs and 37% fat, but that absolute contribution of fat is actually still higher at this 9-minute pace, right? He's burning 5 calories per minute from fat. And then finally, as he exercises with a slightly higher intensity, finally, that absolute contribution does start to decrease from fat, where it's a little lower at 8:30 and 8-minute pace. So this is showing you that just because the relative contribution increases from carbohydrate doesn't make it any better for doesn't make it any worse for burning fat. In fact, it makes it better. Right? These numbers show you this, and we see this all the time on the metabolic cart. It's very cool, and this is for practical recommendations. We have to find an exercise intensity that maximizes our absolute fat utilization, not our relative. That's it. Let's move on to the next one. So the book finally then starts to talk about how can we upregulate our fat oxidation. One way we upregulate our fat oxidation is through very low carbohydrate diets. If we're glycogen depleted, we really only have one other energy source, and it has to come from fat. As a coach or as a practitioner, the question would be, is this a practical guideline for endurance athletes, we'll say? And this has kind of been a debate over the last 30, 40 years, and it really stems from this one study, the Finney study. If any of you guys have had me for research methods, it's you know that this is what my master's thesis was on, and for some of you, I've already given you this study. Well, guess what? You guys are going to read it again, because now it should be a little bit more relevant because we're studying fat oxidation. And what the author did, Finney, he took 5 cyclists and put them on a super low carbohydrate diet, a ketogenic diet. He tested them to exhaustion, pre and post, and I'm not going to tell you anything else because I want you guys to read the study. The study started a wave of research into low carbohydrate diets. And what I can tell you is, based on most of the research, right, is that we don't really support a low carbohydrate diet for performance in endurance sports. It doesn't really improve it, and it may in fact decrease performance. Okay? And there's a lot of research on this. As far as caffeine goes, we have found that caffeine can increase the mobilization of free fatty acids, so it can upregulate hormone-sensitive lipase. However, we're not really sure if it increases our actual oxidation of fat, but it's what is important to note is that caffeine can definitely improve performance. So, all right, we talked about research. We talked about upregulating fat oxidation. You're probably saying, just give me some damn numbers. Give me some numbers. So when we're talking about recommendations, we've talked so far about recommendations for protein. You guys know my simple guideline is 1 gram per pound of body weight. We've talked about recommendations for carbohydrates, and that really depends on the sport, the intensity, the duration. Recommendations can really range from 3 grams per kilogram upwards of 12 grams per kilogram for like ultra endurance athletes. Recommendations for fat really are the last macronutrient we calculate. Okay, so it's pretty simple. So the way to do this, I'm just going to give you guys an example. All right, let's just say we have a resistance trained basketball player who lifts 3 times per week. He or she stands 5'9" and is 180 pounds. Right, 180 pounds. So what's the first thing? If I'm actually working with a client, what's the first thing I should do when trying to give some macronutrient breakdowns? Well, the first thing we need to do is calculate their total daily energy expenditure. Right? So I put in a very hypothetical total daily energy expenditure of 3,300 calories. That's how many calories it would take to maintain that athlete's existence, to maintain their weight, right? And we're just saying, for argument's sake, that we want to maintain weight. We don't want to lose or gain. Once we have that, we then start to calculate their protein requirements. That's always my next step. Well, I already told you 1 gram per pound. So if they weigh 180 pounds, I'm going to tell them to eat 180 grams of protein, right? In the column on the right, 180 grams equates to roughly 720 calories. Next column, or the next thing we calculate. Next thing we calculate is carbohydrate, and that's going to be a little bit more variable based on their activity. I chose to go with 6 grams per kilogram, right? The athlete is 180 pounds or 82 kilograms. So I multiplied 6 times 82, which gave us a recommendation of 492 grams of carbohydrates per day. Definitely on the high end, but again, this is a basketball player. Needs to be very active, needs to eat calories to support their performance, right? 492 grams of carbohydrates equates to 1,968 calories, right? That's 492 times 8, because 1 gram of carbohydrates equates to 4 calories of energy. Okay, so hopefully you guys are following me. Next step. What's their total calories we've done so far? So that would be the next step, where I add the total calories and the total calories, the total calories from protein and the total calories from carbohydrates. So that's the 720 plus the 1968, and that comes to 2,688 calories from protein and carbohydrates. So if I'm recommending that, the last step is pretty simple. Fat intake should be that total daily energy expenditure minus what I've already recommended, 2688, which will leave them with 612 calories from fat. And that's my recommendation, 612 calories from fat. The final thing is, for food recommendations, we never really talk with the client in terms of calories other than TD, right? For protein, we always say grams. For carbs, we always say grams. Well, fat, we need to convert this calorie number to grams. So we would divide the 612 by 9, right? And that leaves us with 68 grams of fat as their recommendation for their diet. This is a little, this is completely written on my own. It's a little lower than the standard recommendation, right? The standard recommendation is very, very roughly 1 gram per kilo. So at 1 gram per kilo, we would recommend about 82 grams of fat, but this is relatively close, and I'm okay with recommending 68. So hopefully you guys were able to follow along, but this is literally what I would do with a client. I do it all the time here in my office, and that's kind of how I would break things down.